Hey folks, so this is just a little video I thought I'd record, kind of following up on a lot of the criticism that has come the county championship's way since England's underperformance over the past 18 months, but particularly in the recent series against Australia and then against the West Indies. There just seemed to be a lot of analysis of the county championship that was quite negative, that the pitches and the quality was significantly down, and that meant that England's players were very poorly prepared to perform at international level. And I always just thought that these were interesting opinions, but I never felt they were particularly backed up with any real evidence. So I thought I'd have a little look at how the county championship shapes up against international alternatives, against first-class tournaments across the globe, and just get a feel for just how bad county championship batting truly is. So the first thing I thought I'd do, well, what would you do if you're a selector? Well, you might look at the top 10 batters in the competition to get a feel for, obviously who's performing, who's showing form at the highest level of domestic cricket, who might be a interesting character to bring into the international team. And I think what was quite interesting looking at last season's stats from the county championship is, despite talk of just how badly England's openers seemed to struggle, the top 3 scorers were all openers. So you got Tom Haines there at Sussex, Libby at Worcestershire, and Robson at Middlesex. Top scorers, and so showing decent averages, averaging in the 40s, Libby there in the mid-50s, decent strike rates also. And then there are a few standouts, aren't there? You've got number 4 there, David Bedingham, middle order bat at Durham, averaging 60. Hashim Amla, averaging nearly 60. And then down the very bottom, Ollie Pope, averaging nearly 80. So some really phenomenal numbers there, but obviously they stand out for different reasons. David Bedingham is a South African. He hasn't played international cricket so far, so he could yet qualify for England. And of course, Hashim Amla is a South African legend. And Ollie Pope, well, he's a player long touted as a great international batsman, but has really struggled to transfer any of that domestic form to international cricket. And then down the bottom there, I picked out some other performers to sort of keep an eye out from last season. So obviously you had Alex Lees, who ended up in the West Indies. He had an okay year, averaging a little under 40. Hasib Hamid, who ended up in Australia with the team for the Ashes. Another okay season there for him, with an average in the sort of upper 30s. Darren Lawrence had a good year, average of over 50. Adam Lyth I picked out. Well, he's a particular favourite of mine, and we'll see later on that he's figured in the sort of top batters for the county championship for a few seasons recently. Decent year for him as well. Zach Crawley, his numbers are always down, to be honest. Keaton Jennings, another name we talk about a lot, okay season. David Malan, very good season with few innings, and Rory Burns, a good season with an average, approaching 50. So, the numbers here look good, don't they? The top batters are all averaging in the 40s. You've got a few standouts there averaging in the 50s and higher. The strike rates, England's batters seem to struggle sometimes to score at a decent rate at international level, but again at domestic level, people say the pitches are hard to play on, that run scoring can be hard. So maybe you go for a quick shorter score, perhaps, rushing it. But the strike rates are good, the averages are good. I suppose what's interesting about this top 10 from last season is that so few of those names did feature in debates about who might join the squad in Australia or in the West Indies. So it does beg the question about how these players are being viewed after strong performances in the county championship. Again, you've got a few younger players there in Tom Haines and Matt Critchley, perhaps emerging talents, and that's kind of reflected in their averages. Tom Haines, good season last season, and we'll be interested to see how he goes this, but his first class average still sits in the mid-30s. Same there for Libby, and Critchley in the lower 30s. So I think consistency is a question in the county championship. Do players perform consistently over the years? And as a selector, are you looking to pick someone who's showing form in that particular season, or are you looking for that longer term perspective? So what I did after that is I just went to the season before. Obviously COVID has disrupted a lot of recent seasons, but it was interesting to see, who the top performers were from previous seasons. So I went back initially to 2019 when we had the 2 divisions set up, and this is the top 10 from Division 1 and then Division 2. So now we've got 20 players on England's radar, you might say, of sort of top domestic performers. And again, I suppose it's striking that so few of the names on these lists really figure in debates about who might represent England at international level. Obviously at the very top there, Dom Sibley. Oh, he had a great season, didn't he? Look at that, averaging nearly 70. I mean, tremendous year. Down the bottom, Hassan Azad, great season for him. He's been a pretty consistent form for Leicestershire and very much a Red Bull specialist, averaging over 50. But then again, few of the names are recognisable if you're just following the England international setup. Again, at the top, some real standouts. Alistair Cook there, performing well with an average in the 40s, in the mid 40s again. But what I thought, well, okay, so it's interesting that from one season to the next, the same names don't really come up. And there's our Adam Lyth, who had a brief England stint. You can see from this season, from the 2019 season, that the averages for the year do drop off quite dramatically. You've got Bell Drummond there, who figures in the top 10, even though he's only got an average of 35. Crawley and Lyth in the top 10 in terms of run scorers with averages of 34. So, going back to this setup, the averages do drop off quite significantly, and then your sort of average there is still sort of mid 40s, and in Division 2 is slightly higher in the early 50s. So there's a consistency question there. How do players perform year on year? So that's why I looked back on this set of 20 and looked at their sort of 3-year averages. So how did they fare in the year before 2018? Then how did they fare in the year 2017, and giving them sort of a 3-year average then. And you can see there that it's pretty wild. Dom Sibley again shows to be an improving but consistent performer with a 3-year average of 45, obviously helped by that average of 70 in that final year. So you'd say that in terms of selectors looking at the County Championship, he definitely would have been identified as a great talent. And well, we've kind of seen how he's fared at international level. Technique-wise, there were questions. He kind of got found out, and he got dropped like a stone before the Ashes, and now doesn't even have an England central or incremental contract. He has essentially been binned. Gary Ballance, very consistent performer. Obviously he has significant issues off the field at the moment, so a player who's unlikely to feature in any England squads in the future, but a very consistent performer, probably the most consistent on that Division 1 list. Alistair Cook, consistent performer. Sam Northeast not featuring in debates about the England squad, and you'd say that about the rest of the list there, with the exception of Jack Crawley, who has one of the worst 3-year averages on that list, including an average of just 12.5 in 2017, and that was from a few innings. That wasn't just a one-off sort of thing. So again, how players perform over time, the consistency, how that's interpreted by selectors, does seem to be a bit interesting. There seems to be a lack of consistency really in terms of how players are identified from the county championship and how they progress to the national side, and how those domestic performances relate to international results. Down the bottom again, Alex Lee's looking out, one to look out for, their average of 37, but a 3-year average of just 28. So another player who you might wonder quite what he's done to deserve being put into the international team ahead of, say, Sam Robson, who again appears there number 9 on the list for Division 2, 3-year average of 35, so quite a bit better, and a sort of more consistent performer in terms of runs in the county championship than Alex Lees. So then I thought, well, let's have a little look around the globe and see how the English players kind of compare to other domestic first-class leagues. Just to see if it is that bad. So here we've got India and Australia. These are the top 10 batters from sort of the last completed domestic competitions. Obviously COVID again causing much disruption, so some of these aren't from the last season, but it's just sort of an indication of how they shape up. And well, the Indian numbers are just incredible. I mean, the Ranji Trophy has a lot more teams in it. There's a lot more potential for mismatches across divisions, but the numbers are insane. Averages there well over 50, average of 154 there for Sarfaraz Khan, top player there with an average of 95. Strike rates as well, interestingly, far higher than what we've seen in the English County Championship. And the ages as well, interesting. A lot of veterans there. Bisht, Gopra, Jackson, all in their mid to late 30s there. So long performing players there, showing real aggressive numbers, which is interesting. The Ranji Trophy with a slightly different scoring setup, whereas in England it's all based around the performance in the first innings, how many runs you score, how many wickets you get. The advantage in terms of points is which team scores the most runs in the first innings. As simple as that. And I think that might be an indicator of how Indian domestic first class players are kind of encouraged to score big and score quickly, perhaps, because if you can race out to a total in the 450s, then well, the opposition can take as long as they want then to try and score 451 to get an advantage on the point system. But it's all about scoring as big as you can in that first innings, and maybe this is somewhat reflected in how these run totals and averages kind of shape out. For Australia, it's sort of a similar story. Strike rates sort of more comparable to England, but the average is again significantly higher. So is this an indicator of better quality players coming through in India and in Australia? Well, obviously the performance of the international teams will tell you yes. It's also interesting that a lot more international players or players that are connected to the international team appear on that Australian list. Obviously Cam Green, Travis Head, Marnus Labuschagne, well, all of those players bar perhaps Jake Doran have been sort of part of, or are seen as part of, Australia's international setup. So yeah, again a question there about just how much domestic cricket England's international players are able to play, and the extent to which selectors do look at county championship performance as an indicator of whether players should move to the international team. So just skipping around, we've got South Africa and West Indies here. I've kind of put these together just for convenience sake rather than anything significant. South Africa averages, again, you'd say they're comparable, but certainly higher. Some big standouts in Viren and Markram, again, players who have featured for the international team since. Strike rates are kind of comparable. But I think what's interesting with the South African one is that first class average. So South African players seem to be showing a bit more consistency really than the English players. There are some younger players on that list, but only 2 of that top 10 average lower than 40, and only a touch lower than 40. And both of those players, Cyril Irwi and Dom Frederick Hendricks, have featured for the national side. So just more consistency seemingly being evidenced by South African players, which might point to mentality, coaching or technique. Hard to tell. And then the West Indies, well, the West Indies sort of domestic setup has often quite significant chops and changes. But again, you'd say that averages lower than England, but comparable as are strike rates. The names there will be familiar to folks who follow international and obviously West Indies domestic cricket. Jos da Silva, of course, hitting that century in the 3rd Test that got West Indies to that victory. John Campbell featured for the international side as well in that series, but look at that, gets onto the top 10 having scored 491 runs with an average of just 32. And a career average of under 30. I mean, some of them really do stand out for, really low career averages in the West Indies, and we know how hard batting can be out there. but they've been able to get the job done, and perhaps signs of improvement when you look at this season's stats with players, scoring over 50. Blackwood, Myers, De Silva, all players who are now in the national squad. We're on the back of good domestic performances. And then finally, two from New Zealand at the top and Pakistan at the bottom. So again, the thing is, when you look at it, it's much of a muchness, and you do think the criticism of the county championship and the first class game in England, I mean, does it stack up when you look at these other tournaments around the world? Is it a case that it's harder to bat in a domestic competition in England? Or is it more a case of players that perform in the county championship not being able to replicate that at international level, whether they're unprepared for different conditions, different pitches, or whether it is a case of coaching, mentality, leadership, more psychological than technical issues really that cause players that perform well domestically to underperform internationally. And again, here, New Zealand, World Test Championship winners, so their domestic competition and the sort of conditions they play in as well, sort of very comparable to England. And again, I think you'd say that the numbers are very comparable. Overall average there is sitting at 49, strike rate touch over 50. And again, you've got players that maybe haven't evidenced long-term consistency with those first-class averages sitting largely in the mid to high 30s. A few standouts there as well. Conway with his average of 50 on the season and 48 on the year. You've got Hamish Rutherford, who's been around the international side, well, some time ago now, but is still a consistent player domestically. Sort of numbers that are comparable to England. Again, fewer players in that list that are full regular internationals. But of course, this is a side that managed to win the World Test Championship, so they've managed to produce players domestically that go on to perhaps perform better at international level. So again, where's the value there? Where are the issues? And then at the bottom there, it's Pakistan, another nation that's had, whose domestic setup changes quite a lot. But some big numbers again. I mean, this guy Horaira, the opener, just 19 years of age, and a tremendous average there for the season, 58, with a strike rate of nearly 70. So, some real young talents to look out for there. There's Saad Khan further down the list at 22, who also managed to average in the 60s with a strike rate in the 60s. So some really interesting young players coming through there in Pakistan, and numbers that do look far better than England's there, with the average over that 10 of being closer to 60, with a strike rate also higher than England. But again, comparable numbers. So when we put them alongside each other, where do we sit? Well, we saw, India, the averages are quite insane for that top 10. It's a very small sample size, but this was always supposed to be more indicative than anything else. But across the top 10 there, an average of nearly 80 at a strike rate of nearly 70. And then showing that consistency with a first-class average for those players of nearly 50. So yeah, I mean, India is certainly an outlier in terms of the sheer volume of runs that is scored and the rate that they're scored at. But then, England sit very much in the middle, and those numbers look pretty good. If you were an international player and you were averaging 53 at a strike rate of 58, you'd be pretty happy with yourself. Better than New Zealand, better than the West Indies, listed by the average, but very much in the middle. So, if we're looking at the highest performers domestically, and we're looking at the talent that the county championship is producing, is it any better or worse than domestic competitions around the world? This sort of suggests not. So, in terms of conclusions then, well, is it a lack of consistency at domestic level that causes this question of the county championship being detrimental to the international team? Or is it underperformance? Do players who perform well domestically fail to translate that quality to international level? And of course, this goes for all of the domestic competitions we've looked at. Players who perform well in the Ranji Trophy in India will not have played overseas until they reach international level. I mean, they're likely to do more if they play IPL and different sort of T20 formats, etc., around the globe. But in terms of first-class cricket, you aren't going to get that exposure to wickets in Pakistan and the West Indies, unless you do a sort of a tour with your county side, or in a competitive sense when you reach international level. So the challenges are the same for these players coming from domestic to international cricket. But is the issue a lack of consistency in sort of performance that leads to a lack of coherency in selection, or do players genuinely get to international level and then underperform? At which point the question is more about why England's coaches, England's performance teams can't encourage those players to perform to that level at international games. Dom Sibley being a great example, really, of a player who, on the numbers at least, looks like he ended up being pretty poorly done by the England setup there. Improving, evolving his game domestically, gets to the national side, and then slowly kind of slips in performance and ends up out of the squad entirely. I mean, the other thing to compare there is just the numbers. So in terms of innings, well, we talk about a red ball reset. Well, is a red ball reset going to be about less red ball cricket? Again, in terms of creating quality players, India and Australia, they're top of the list in terms of averages, and they play a lot less cricket than we do, than England does in a first-class season. So is it less about quantity and more about quality? Talk a lot about scheduling. Should we be really looking to reduce the number of games that are played at first-class level, kind of increase the quality, and then see how that translates to performances at international level? Maybe these numbers would be more reliable if there were less games, more competition, more concentration of quality of players, perhaps. I wouldn't say reducing the number of teams in the county championship is doable, because that means sort of pushing teams into non-existence. But some form of concentrating the quality, concentrating the emphasis, so that players, their numbers perhaps are better reflective of how they play in competitive environments than simply over the course of a long season where maybe one or two big scores make you stand out. So, do selectors trust that the format is producing quality? Are they looking at the right players? Again, that first list we saw, those players, Tom Haines, Libby, not even considered perhaps as an opener for the West Indies series, despite performing well. Alex Lee selected ahead of them, despite a fairly average few years for him. So are selectors really trusting the format, and do we play too much first-class cricket? Does that lead to that sort of distrust in the numbers? And then what are the advantages of two divisions? In this video, we haven't gone into how first-class formats are kind of organised around different countries, but two divisions with a very hard and fast promotion and relegation, that's something that's pretty unique to England, and one wonders if it really creates a sort of better quality first division. Should England be prioritising players in the first division because it's better than the second? Is that the nature of it? In the same way in football, you wouldn't expect England scouts to be in League One or League Two, or even the Championship. Like, is there a true reflection of better quality in the higher division? And we touched on it with the India stats. So should we look at changing how we incentivise first big innings scores, in how this point system is played out in the county championship? Would it be better to follow the Indian system, whereby the team that scores the highest total in that first innings sort of takes control of the game, if you like, gets the draw points? And that's particularly important in knockout cricket. So when the Ranji Trophy gets to its knockout stage, the quarter, semi and final stage, you can win the game simply by having the biggest first innings score. So that's a real incentive, particularly in those high pressure environments, to bat big and bat long in order to put your side on top. You can win the Ranji Trophy having made the knockout stages, not winning a single game, if you put on the biggest score in that first innings, and then play out the draw. So that's definitely an incentive for players perhaps to revise their mentality in those first innings in particular. And then what about England's focus on young players? Zach Crawley, it's probably maybe unfair to pick on him, but he's a player who seems to feature prominently in England's future plans, despite not really evidencing real consistency both at domestic and international level. And then when we look at the numbers in terms of the top 10 batters that we've looked at, the average age is consistently in the high 20s, early 30s. So players do peak after having years of experience. Should England be focusing on youth as much as they are, or should we be looking at form? Should we be looking at consistency and be less afraid of bringing in a player to the squad who's in their 30s? After all, international cricket is about winning now. Planning for the future and having a pipeline of players coming into the squad is obviously important, but you aren't necessarily building for the future when those players may have dips in form or may suffer injuries. It's a win now mentality you've got to have. So is picking the players that are best for the team about youth, or is it more about that consistency? So this is kind of my suggestion for the ECB, which somewhat happened in the Bob Willis Trophy during sort of the COVID season. 3 regional divisions, 8 matches each, so each team in each division plays each other once, plus 3 sort of interleague games. Top 4 qualifying, so the winner of each division plus the best second place, and then you get your semi-final and final. So that's 8 matches, total of 16 innings if you don't get out of the group stages, and a total of 10 matches, 20 innings if you play all innings and get all the way to the final. So a big reduction in the number of games, freeing up space in the calendar perhaps to make the other formats work as well. Opportunity to put the county championship into a better part of the calendar, and hopefully increase the quality by making more matches more significant. If you've got a race on for qualification, etc. And it kind of brings us in line with how domestic 4-day cricket is played around the globe. So in terms of other observations, well, I'm releasing this video on Sunday in April, so the county championship has just started. It's the final day of the first round of fixtures, so it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of weeks how things shape up as England look to prepare for their summer home tests. Some interesting games coming up. New Zealand 3 tests. We've got the 5th test of that abandoned series against India, and then in August we have South Africa for 3 tests. So what to look out for at the beginning of this season's county championship? Well, I suppose a lot will depend on the new management and what is the idea at this moment. Is it about development or is it about victories? Obviously, the West Indies series was fairly controversial for the omission of Anderson and Broad, and for the inclusion of some players who perhaps hadn't yet proven themselves. Lees, Crawley, Lawrence, players that hadn't really done the job in Australia kind of got through, others didn't, and many players binned off. Burns at the top of the order, Hamid, players who were somewhat abandoned with the idea of them showing their quality in the county championship. So will they do that? Big question remains those openers. Who to look out for. Will Tom Haines, can he replicate his form from last year, and will that mean that he will feature in the debate? And then is there a place for those veterans? If this new management structure looks at quality and consistency over age, is there a place for a Lyth or a Robson to come back into the squad if they really do perform in the opening rounds of this year's county championship? So generally speaking, squad players need to prove themselves. England's batting in the West Indies showed some real improvements. Obviously, it was nice to be scoring 350, 400, even 500 as a team. But overall, of course, the results didn't come from that. The bowling didn't quite get it done. Yes, the pitches in the Windies were pretty placid for those first 2, but obviously it was that 3rd test where England's batting was once again horribly exposed, and ended up practically losing by an innings to a team whose batting is should not have been that superior. So again, the batting did let down the side, really. So, my feeling is that, however things change in terms of management, the squad isn't going to change significantly. Root, Lawrence, Stokes, Bairstow, Folkes, that the core middle order, you can't see that changing too much in terms of the squad. But can Pope, Burns, Sibley even push for reselection? Are there players there who have been out of the squad who can really make a case for coming back into it? You can add Milan to that list, Butler perhaps. I mean, I don't see the England setup, really going zany with squads this summer. Maybe including a couple of younger players to get some exposure perhaps, but I just don't see the squad changing too much, even with the underperformance. Obviously the potential for a new captain, will they have a new attitude? To be honest, I don't think so. If it's Root, I can't see things changing too much. He's got this idea that he's rebuilding this squad. If it were to move on to Stokes, I think he'd follow suit. In terms of selection, I suppose the question for the batting remains those openers that just cannot establish themselves. And then in terms of the bowling side, well, are we truly over Anderson and Broad? That will be the question there, which I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in seeing whether they're fully moving on anymore, or whether they'll be back in as one would expect. So I don't anticipate any real creative selection decisions, which could be interesting. And again, makes you wonder whether selectors truly value the county championship and whether domestic players who perform well are really given the chance they need to perform at international level. And then I suppose you've got to look at those red and white ball centrally contracted players. So England haven't separated out red and white ball central contracts. So Milan, Butler and Liam Livingstone, even, who's on an incremental contract, those are players who are obviously a big part of England's plans. So will those be three players who are sort of on the priority list for England sort of scouts and observations in the early rounds of the county championship, if they play very much, for performance? Obviously Butler and Livingstone are off in the IPL now, so we probably won't see any of them at all. But if they're centrally contracted and they perform, will they be the kind of players that England will perhaps look at as coming into the squad? But anyway, guys, some interesting talking points there. I think for me the big takeaway is that, looking at the numbers at the very least, the county championship doesn't seem any better or worse than domestic first-class competitions around the world. For me, the biggest question is why players who perform domestically cannot perform internationally. Yes, we might look at pitches. Yes, we might look at technique. But ultimately, is it more about leadership? Is it more about mentality? When you look at nations around, the other cricketing nations, they all have to face the same questions of how you take players from your domestic setup and expose them to pitches and conditions that are very foreign to them. But obviously, when you look at teams like New Zealand, Australia, they're able to do that to an extent that England really can't. So for me, it's less an issue of the county championship and the pitches, and more an issue of how players are adapted to international cricket with the international team. And then, well, the question in terms of format, I've put up my little sort of suggestion there, but I think when you look at how competitions are shaped around the globe, England could well benefit from reducing and condensing the amount of first-class cricket that's played. So my observation, so big takeaways, guys. Maybe less first-class cricket in England for better international cricket and better quality first-class cricket in England. And is it more? I think it's more an issue of how players adapt from domestic to international cricket than coming from domestic cricket as players who cannot adapt. Anyway, Hope you have a great weekend and see you around. Ciao. Obviously a lot of discussion points here. I'm not really active in comments, but feel free to put your 4 pence in. Ciao, ciao.